Welcome everyone to today's webinar, 6 security challenges to your high-stakes test program and how data forensics may help thwart them. I'm Skylar Weisenberger with Caveon, and I'm very pleased to be joined by my 2 colleagues, Steve Addicott and Dennis Maynes. Steve is Vice President of Client Services for Caveon, and Dennis is Caveon's Chief Scientist. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. You may notice that you're on mute, so you won't be able to speak to us directly. So if you have any questions or comments, please enter them in the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll try to answer those questions in the order they're received when we pause for questions, and also at the end of the session. So again, welcome, and if you guys are ready, I'll turn the time over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Skylar. So really what we're talking about today are test security challenges that plague pretty much every high-stakes test program out there, certainly most certification programs. So what we want to do, well, and let me stop. We will share these slides with you, and we're also recording this session, and we will share the recording of the session with you. Typically, that's a question people ask. So what we want to do is discuss the real impact of these 6 challenges on programs like yours. We'll dive into each one of the 6, sort of highlight the characteristics of each. We want to share some potential solutions and approaches for contending with them, including the role of data forensics. Now, this will not be a deep dive into the science and math, but it will be a discussion of the role of data forensics as a tool in dealing with these challenges. Then we'll have some wrap-up and Q&A. We may address some questions throughout the session, but we'll definitely make sure we have time at the end of today to answer your questions. So, the magnitude of the problem. I think several of us at Caveon were first alerted to how severe these challenges could be way back in 2005. At that point, there was a for-profit piracy site, a Braindump for sale, buy test items here, that was going out of business. And they had sort of a, hey, we're going out of business, bargain basement deal on their inventory, where at that point, we bought 500 live exams for $200. So if you do some back of the napkin math, 500 exams, 60 questions on average each, maybe $300 to build a test item. That was some $9 million in test development that was made readily available for $200. So that was then, 2005. 2012, things are still very troubling. I was involved in the ATP Security Committee Security Survey in 2012. And one of the questions posed to the 50 certification programs that responded to the survey was, hey, have you identified any exact matches of your tests on the internet? And at that point, some 22 programs, 41%, indicated they had. It was also sort of interesting because in general, these programs thought they had test security pretty tightly secured, but they also indicated that the cost of these live tests that were found on the internet, the replacement cost, ranged between 88 and 223 million. So, holy smokes, $88 million of test development compromised. And that, of course, didn't take in the softer losses around perceived erosion of the accreditation, or are there people out there with the accreditation that may not really have the requisite knowledge and skills, all those kinds of things. So it's a pretty stark situation when you look at the impact of these challenges. Now, what are these challenges? Well, Dennis wrote a paper back in 2009 called Caveon Speaks Out on IT Security. We'll send you these slides. It's a very well thought and crafted document, I think. But he identified these 6 challenges that were faced by IT programs then, but of course, for whatever reason, IT is sort of the leading edge, and the test fraud challenges that were pretty unique to IT then are now, of course, encountered by most certification programs. And if you're not seeing one of these yet, you probably will be in the near future. So we're talking about the fact that proxy test taking is big business. Braindump usage continues and continues to be a challenge. Test theft in many areas appears unchecked. Technology is a great tool for gaining unfair advantage during my actual test administration if I'm sitting for an exam. There are challenges around garnering stakeholder support in instituting real stringent and strong test security policies. And different test administration models present different security dilemmas. So with that as an overview of the 6 challenges, I'm going to turn things over to Dennis. Want to fill us in on some of the things you've seen with proxies, Dennis, please?
Thank you, Steve. So in 2007, we did a special project for a certification program. We contracted with a proxy test taker to take a test for us. And our goal was to find out where the test was taken, take the data, bring it in, analyze it, and discover what we could from the data about proxies and about the impact of the program. As these proxy test takers are out there blatantly saying, well, we'll take the test for you. Well, nowadays, what I've seen is the cost for taking a test is not $1,000, it's more like $4,000. And when we found this site, when we found the data, we looked at it, well, now we knew the test site. We knew the test that was actually taken by a proxy. And we found that this test site had been registered with a false mailing address. So they falsified their registration data. It was affiliated with another site. So now we had 2 for 1. And then we looked at the data using data forensics, similarity, timing, other kinds of statistics. And we've pretty, I think, accurately inferred that there were 5 more test sites that were being operated by these, the same organization in other countries. So this was, and the data we had were 6 months of data. Excuse me. And it was 500 exams that we estimated these proxy test takers had taken at $1,000 each. That's $500,000 times 2 is $1 million a year. That was back in 2007. So this is big business. They have a lot of motivation to do this. Let's go forward, please. And so just since it's not hard to find these people on the internet. For example, from certtoday.com, they say they have safe and reliable methods, and they keep their methods anonymous. And these sites are using sophisticated paywalls. They're vetting people very carefully so that they don't get exposed. And not only that, so this other panel down here, pay an expert to take an online exam for you. This is from a website called allhomework.net. And Cert Today is primarily specializes in IT exams. Allhomework.net specializes in any kind of exam that you want to pay them to take for you. They say they will find an expert to take the test for you that you want taken. So it's out there. And there are a lot of sites out there where they're taking money, and people feel like it's reasonable to do this for whatever reason. That's the important thing here. Let's next slide, please. So just some observations of what we think is going on. First of all, a lot of these places, the proxies have a home. You know, they've established a legitimate test site where they may have a front room and a back room. And the back room is where they do their nefarious work. And the front room is where people come and take the test legitimately. They can transcend borders and be across the globe. often we will see when proxies are operating that you will see them answering the questions at a superhuman rate. I've talked to a lot of certification program managers. Oh, people cannot answer questions at 5 seconds per question. Well, we have seen it. And we've seen them answer hundreds of questions at that rate, faster than you can humanly read. People are able to memorize the content quite well. So what we see is they're starting to expand their business like any other business. They're branching out into more and more certifications. And you have to be really careful the way you deal with this, because if you just shut down test sites or shut down these, they'll just move their business to another place. They just move on, and they'll stay in business. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about brain dump usage. Now, brain dumps are not always the words that are used. Sometimes people say remembered questions or recalled questions, and you'll see that a lot. So we're going to use the word brain dump, but please remember it could be recalled questions also. Next slide. And what we've seen, next slide please. Thank you. Okay, what we've seen, so here I just want to talk about a case, some data that we analyzed with data forensics. And what we had is, I've just abbreviated things here somewhat. We had a test taker, let's call it the 313. Took the exam January 25th. This is 2 years ago, about 10 o'clock. By 4 o'clock, a document had been produced with this person's name attached to it, which disclosed 97% of the questions. And they were near exact. They weren't exact, meaning they probably were recorded using a video camera and then transcribed. You know, when that happens, there are minor errors that enter into the text. And so we analyzed the data, and we found 4 other people from the same company took the same test in the 2 days before through similarity analysis. And so now we have a group of 5. We feel like this person on the 25th actually was trying out all this information they had amassed, accumulated together, took it into the test site, and started using the test questions. Is this good? And then we had 11 more people by similarity analysis that, yeah, they're also associated. The probability of independent test taking was less than 1 chance in 10 to the 38th power. It's more likely that the last person to win the Powerball lottery will win the next 4 jackpots than this would have happened by chance alone. And it's interesting to note that 10 of the questions had wrong answer keys, wrong answers selected, they had created. And this often happens too in these kind of theft cases. Let's go forward, please. So we believe that it's really rampant. There are people out there saying, I'll do whatever it takes to pass this test. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy to study. I'm just going to go do the quick fix, the easy thing. I deserve it, and these tests are just horrible, and they're unfair anyway. And what we have seen is people who use the content could be as great as 15% or even higher for some programs. And it's not just profiteers like the website that was selling all these tests for 500 tests for $200. They're small groups. They just work together, collaborate, to steal the content and brain dump. We know that they're getting smarter about the way the tests are administered, about security measures you may be implementing. So you have to stay on top of this. They're reacting to new tactics that we are introducing about, for example, item cloning and other things. They're beginning to dissect the content, to say what is going on here, how do we stay ahead of the programs. And it's true that some are naive. Oh, I never knew. You know, I think, so for that reason you need to have education on your website. Let people know this is not allowed. This is improper. make sure they understand that naivete is not a defense. Let's go forward, please. Steve, I think I'll turn the time back to you then.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, so as Dennis said, a lot of the brain dumpers are sort of informal gatherings, online watering holes. Well, the test pirates are a different breed. They are decidedly for profit, and like Proxy, it's big business. Interesting indicator, 2 widely recognized purveyors of stolen test content, testking.com and Pass for Sure, are actually more popular Google searches than Braindump. Clearly, people understand that if you're facing a high-stakes test, there are avenues, there are places to go where you can gain advantage. That's true in the U.S., particularly true internationally. We did a research engagement for a large financial certification program around international test threats. And as part of that, interviewed and surveyed some test security veterans, including Ray Nicosia of ETS. And Ray painted a really scary picture. He said, hey, if you're testing in these areas, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when the pirates will steal your questions. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but they will steal your items. And that was really crystallized for me a few years ago when we were approached by a medical certification program. Not huge, but pretty good sized, about 7,000 candidates a year, 2 administrations a year. One of those 2, 3,500 kids getting ready to take a test on Saturday. The Wednesday before, test program manager received an anonymous email saying, hey, thought you ought to know. And attached to that email was the entire item bank for that Saturday's exam. What do? I mean, truly, seriously, what do you do? Well, ideally, you pull out your security incident response plan, and you've got emergency budget allocated to deal with this, and an emergency item bank that you can immediately invoke. Well, no, this program didn't have any of those things. They had to cancel the administration. 3,500 kids who had studied in school, made travel arrangements, planned to kick off their careers, were put on hold for 6 months. There was no emergency budget. They had to beg, borrow, and steal to find money to rebuild their test. And almost worse, had to face lingering questions around how long have these items been out there? How many people that now have our accreditation don't really have the knowledge and skills to perform this work? And then when we talk about this piracy, this test theft, it's pretty interesting. It's a broad spectrum. Dennis just talked about people sitting for the exam, well, actually pirates bribing candidates to not just sit for the exam, but after the exam regurgitate everything they can remember on particular items or particular sections. And if you get enough of that, you're going to get a pretty clear picture through recall of what the test looks like. On the other side of the spectrum, we see exact mirror images of live item banks with answers where the only conclusion we can really draw is somehow, some way in a dirty test center, someone has successfully hacked into the test system to electronically harvest the exact live items. And then there's somewhere in between where these very hard to identify high-def cameras in the shape of buttons or glasses or pens can be used to harvest items. It's interesting. We see this piracy activity heightened when a test publisher announces that they're republishing an exam, or because the pirates are for profit, they make bold claims like, we guarantee you'll pass with our test prep materials. And so if you do things to thwart them and the pass rates drop, people that buy the materials aren't scoring well, well, then the pirates are highly incented to get back in there and find these new test questions so that they can guarantee their clients will pass. And it's also troubling. We'll see months of test development investment and effort in a new exam completely compromised in just weeks after publication. Terrible. So I think we've got our first poll here.
We do. We have a poll. I'm going to go ahead and launch this. So you'll see the poll question there on your screen. The question is, what is the total amount your program has lost due to proxy, test theft, and other types of fraud over the past 2 years? So we'll go ahead and give you about 15 more seconds to answer. And then I'll pass it to Dennis to give us some feedback on the results. Okay, about another 5 or 8 seconds. Please answer if you haven't yet. Okay, I'm going to close the poll here. And Dennis, I don't know if you can see this on your screen. The results are 70% of our attendees have not calculated that amount. 15% have said it's anywhere from 0 to 100,000. 9% have mentioned that it's between 100K and $1 million. And then only 2% said it's greater than 5 million, but that's a large amount there. So I'll pass it back to you, Dennis.
Sure. So, you know, this is interesting. We have a saying here at Caveon, and that is, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so, for a large number of you, you've not calculated just the amount of loss you've suffered. That's probably one of the first things to do, is to actually begin to calculate those losses, so you can begin to go back to management and indicate, wow, you know, this is affecting us. Now, you know, maybe you are like a lot of programs who say, well, you know, we just don't really have this kind of problem, in which case eternal vigilance is the watchword. Thank you.
So we're going to press on. We've talked about, I think, 3 of the challenges so far. I want to talk a little bit about technology. And I mentioned the use of digital cameras to pirate items. Here, I want to refer more to the use of different, powerful, small communication tools to actually help a candidate gain unfair advantage during the test administration. And it's, once again, I keep saying things are striking. If you do a search, it's pretty astounding how many different types of communication tools, including cameras, Bluetooth, earphones, etc., are available. And it's not just the devices are available. If you do a search, you find the devices, but you also find very detailed how-to tutorials on video of how to use these things. And now we're seeing that the different technologies are being kitted or packaged together into a whole comprehensive cheating solution, like this one, with a neck loop microphone, a high-def camera that can be hidden in the hand, very small Bluetooth hearing devices that are virtually invisible to a proctor because they're so deep in the ear canal, as well as tapping transmitters so that I can sort of use a Morse code-like signal and system for two-way communication. And of course, the system comes with a how-to blueprint that I can gain a sense of how it works in principle. But then here's a real-life example of this kind of system used during an administration of the MCAT. So here is a guy sitting for the exam. Outside the walls of the test center is his accomplice. Guy taking the test has a pinhole camera and a wireless technology that allows him to transmit images to his conspirator. The co-conspirator outside has 3 tutors with whom he's communicating through text or phone, I'm not sure which. And what's scary, this is completely undetectable to the proctor. This exam took place in a very secure test center with a trained proctor at one of the very large test delivery providers. And this is not an indictment against them because these devices are so invisible. The only way this situation was identified is because the tutors became suspicious and alerted authorities, and the 2 individuals were caught and reprimanded. Unfortunately, the damage was done. AAMC reported that the breach cost approximately $200,000 because the compromised test had to be discontinued and replaced. Scary. That's what we're dealing with. Now, switching gears to the 5th of the challenges, stakeholder support. In order to institute powerful, meaningful test security policies, procedures, it's imperative to garner stakeholder support. Now, what we've seen is sometimes that can be a challenge because in some cases legal departments are reluctant to take really strong action like revoking or invalidating a certification. That can open up a true legal can of worms in many ways. We also see where it may be tough to get executive buy-in to strong security measures simply because leadership is not fully apprised or fully clear on the extent of the problem and how severe the losses truly are. We also see situations, we see this in construction, we see this in IT, we see this in some areas of medical training, where the organizational structure where training and tests are delivered through partners can be a challenge because those partnering organizations may be opposed to closing test centers, closing training centers, et cetera, because it impedes their revenue stream. And sometimes some or all of these challenges are compounded because of ineffective internal and external stakeholder communications. But what we do know is that nothing but goodness is yielded when you can ensure that your tests truly measure what they are intended to measure. And there are success stories. And we've got clients in a bunch of different areas of certification that can attest to this, but I love this example. Liz Burns, she's currently with Juniper Networks. In her prior life at EMC, she was successful in garnering that executive and legal support and posted this blog article, and I love the second to last sentence. Hey, any exam results found to be questionable with a high probability of being the result of exam fraud, we revoke. We've been doing this, and it's successful. You have been warned. Okay, switching gears to the last of the 6 challenges. Dennis, what is it about some of the test administration models you're seeing?
Well, thank you, Steve. So we know that most programs are unique. You all face different challenges. And a one-size-fits-all approach to test security, especially when it comes to the test sessions, is not really adequate. So you have to pay attention to your model. So I have here just a few things that I'm going to add ad-lib a few things too. And that is, security breaches are really going to be more likely when the tests are out there all the time, 24/7. It's just out there so much that any person who has an inkling of gaining an advantage, getting a buck, they can steal your test. And that doesn't matter, whether it's computer-based test or paper pencil, the mode doesn't matter. What matters is that it's out there all the time. Now we see variations of this, right? We see window testing, where the test is administered for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then retired. Then you have this window of time, and test takers are able to leverage that in terms of if they collaborate together and collude, they can send 1 or 2 people in early in the window, just like I showed with this brain dump example, grab the content and share it with the rest of the people. We know that security breaches are more likely when you have franchise test sites. These are people who usually operate test sites for some of the larger vendors, but they may operate multiple sites, and they're not going to vet their employees as well. Maybe they don't do background checks, lots of things that can happen. And those employees in those test sites, they are in the trust network. That's important to realize. If the test sites are being run by boot camps or test prep schools or courses, that's another really red flag. And sometimes in order to market or gain acceptance of the certification, special circumstances will be given for testing around conferences. Rules are suspended. Security breaches are more likely to happen then too. Now what we believe is item compromise is not a result of exposure. The items slowly wear out, they get frayed around the edges or anything like that. These are electronic content. That doesn't happen. More likely people decide to steal, and then they compromise the exam. But back to models. So it's really important to understand, and it's really important to look at the way the session is administered. For example, is it more likely that you're going, so how many proctors do you need if, let's say, you're in a typical paper and pencil-based test? Do you need, and why do you have proctors? So I submit, I think proctors are there to deter cheating more than to discover it, detect it. Now, is it better for the proctors to walk around the room or to stay stationary? I haven't seen anyone actually do a study on this, but I think walking around the room, especially if it's in a regular pattern, can let the test takers know when they can communicate, feel they can do their other nefarious behavior. So if you have them stationary, so let's say they have this wide field of view and they're positioned appropriately, most test takers will feel like, oh, they're being watched and observed. So it's very important to look at the way the tests are given because the test takers can take advantage. Let's go forward. So as far as tests that are administered 24/7, it's just inherently insecure to publish and forget. To think you can just put the test out there and it's going to be secure. You saw the technology that can be used. It is very easy to steal the test with this kind of technology. So you have to monitor what's happening with the test. You have to look at the data and so you can detect when you have an issue or potential issue. Different modes of administering the test will probably require different security measures because the environment is different. And remember, the test takers are taking advantage of the environment. So you need to look at that very carefully and just don't assume that whatever you were taught in school or you learned in a prior life, a prior program, that those security measures are going to be appropriate in your environment. And where you have inherent weakness here in the models, some models are more secure than others, and the costs are going to vary by model. And so you have to factor in that. You have to factor in convenience versus security and cost. You know, when test takers have to travel long distances to only 2 or 3 really hardened test sites, that's going to be very different than when they can just drive down the street at any time and take a test. And you need to factor that in also. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I think we've got a poll now. Let me get, and going to launch that one, Skylar, please.
Sure. This poll is, which of the 6 test security challenges has your program had to contend with? Select one or more of the following. So the first is proxies. We have Braindump and test administration models, technology, and stakeholder support. We don't have an option here for none of them. So if you have not had to contend with any of these, just please maybe just don't answer. We don't have enough options to put another option there. I'm going to give you about 8 more seconds to look these over and answer them. Okay, we're slowing down. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thank you for voting. And Steve, can you see the results?
So this is Dennis. I can see the results. And
there you go. Okay.
About 1 in 4 programs have had trouble with proxies. Braindumps are definitely out there in theft. It's combined together, 70%. Technology is definitely a factor here. And of all the 6, stakeholder support is getting, along with proxies, is getting the fewest number of votes. Those are probably pretty consistent with where I think things are at. Thank you.
All right, moving on. So we've talked about these 6 challenges. Want to change gears a little bit and talk about some security responses and approaches. In doing so, I think it's important to paint the picture that test security must be an ongoing process. It's not a state. Unfortunately, we'll never be at a place where we wave a wand, we institute some new measure, and voila, from now on, our tests are secure. No, we identified these 4 stages. Of course, your programs institute policies and procedures to protect your exams. You must have methods in place to detect when some sort of malfeasance occurs. You've got practical, rapid responses after you detect those breaches, and then let's learn. Let's learn from the breach and our response to improve our protection going forward. We also feel like at each one of these steps, it's critical to measure how well you're performing through each step of this ongoing process. We believe that data forensics is a key, powerful tool for measuring. Let's see, I'm going to move on. So this first stage, protection, I think most of the folks on this webinar do lots of very strong, sound things to protect your exams. So I'm not going to spend much time here. I will note the first bullet, your test use agreement, your candidate agreement may be the strongest arrow in your test security quiver. So if you haven't focused on your agreement recently, it may make sense to do so. The second bullet, messaging, making people aware of what is and is not appropriate test taking is also very powerful. And this can be done in a bunch of different ways. I love what Cisco's done with their online videos. They're clever, they're funny, they're informative, and a great way to, again, make sure everyone knows what's allowed and what isn't. So having these methods of protection, of course, is critically important, but people are going to bend the rules, break the rules, stomp up and down on the rules. So you've got to have those detection pieces in place. Detection may involve your proctors. It may involve a tip line. It may involve web patrolling. It should probably also involve statistical analysis of test data, what we call data forensics. And what's cool is different statistics can identify different kinds of fraud. Similarity can detect proxies, Braindump users, people having unfair access to content. Latency can be used to identify that superhuman proxy test taking that Dennis mentioned. And there are new things, innovative things, like embedded verification tests. Yes, they can flag certain kinds of perpetrators of test fraud, but not to steal Dennis's thunder, can also be used to protect your exam from the impacts of test fraud. So when you have this detection in place, you're then poised to respond appropriately, I hope powerfully, and then, well, it's also key. If you're going to use this kind of detection tool, you must make sure that your policy support it, back to your client, candidate agreements. And we're also seeing that the use of these statistics is moving closer to the actual point of administration, because it's a whole lot easier to nullify a score as being statistically indeterminate right away, rather than trying to, after the fact, revoke an exam or a certificate, revoke a certificate. So I mentioned EVT. Dennis, tell us about this exam inoculation work you're doing.
So this is an area we've been actively thinking about doing some research in for some time now. The idea is you can do things to the exam, design countermeasures into the exam that help you give some robustness against the use of brain dump content or recall questions. If you do that, you don't necessarily need to invalidate scores or shut down test sites, but those can be helpful. But it, by itself, it offers some resistance or resilience. But what you'll have to do if you start to do this is you'll need to republish the test. You can't just let them sit. Can't publish and forget. You will need to design questions that will help you for detecting use of brain dump content, such as EVT, embedded verification test questions. They can help you detect when to republish the exam. And because you're going to be in a process of republishing the exam, it's important that you're continually having a set of questions that are being developed. So you're always ready. So you know when. So when it comes time to republish, you have those questions. All of those things are going to would affect your staff and your processes, and you'll need to recognize that. So we've been looking at other things besides the EVT questions. Cloning, we've been looking at the way pass rates change when you start doing these republications. And it does work. It's not totally effective, but it does work. Okay, let's go forward. I think we have a poll coming up.
We do. Thanks, Dennis. The poll is, which of these exam inoculation techniques have you utilized to protect your exam? Emergency forms, EVT items, embedded verification test items, item cloning, fast test republication, or none of these? And we will give you about 10, 11 more seconds to answer. So Dennis, while we're waiting, we did get a question a couple of minutes ago when you were speaking. Somebody was asking what is meant by a stakeholder
Well, a stakeholder,
when you were talking about them.
stakeholder is someone who has a vested interest in the exam. Could be management, could be partners, could be part of your certification development team. People are running these programs. You have a lot of people to report to who have some particular need for this exam to be administered fairly with validity. Okay, looking at the poll questions, we've got about 1 in 3 have emergency forms. Some are using these new items, EBT items, item cloning, republication, and many are not using any of these techniques. So obviously these numbers add up to more than 100, which means some programs are doing more than one of these interventions. Thank you.
All right.
So I want to talk a little bit about statistics and data forensics detection. And it's really important to understand that statistical anomalies are not necessarily the same as test fraud. Just because you flagged a test site or individual doesn't mean it's fraud. The fact is, there are 4 different areas here: testing irregularities, security violations, security breaches, test fraud. They're all very different. And it's very important to have a really good understanding of where you're at. Statistical anomalies do not detect all types of fraud or all types of irregularities. And that's why these ovals are drawn the way they are. And they may detect things that are not any of these things. That's really important to understand. It's really important to share it, communicate it with your stakeholders. Let's go forward. Another really important thing to communicate with the stakeholders is what the statistical concept of type 1 and type 2 errors. Type 1 error occurs when we improperly decide that a test score is invalid. You know, we have an anomaly, we have something there. Well, we believe this person, their score should be invalidated. That's a type 1 error if it shouldn't be. Type 2 error is failing to detect when the score is invalid. So yeah, someone came in and they did some bad things, they gained an advantage, and we did not detect it, so we cannot take action. That's a type 2 error. Both kinds of errors are bad, but the stakeholders, you know, people running the program need to understand when you're using statistics as statistical decision theory, both types of errors will exist. If you decide that, no, let's use low probabilities, that will decrease type 1 errors to the point that you get to the point that everything you flag, you have extremely high confidence that they should be invalidated. But when you do that, your type 2 errors will go up. So you have to decide. You have to decide how conservative you want to be and how aggressive you want to be and where the errors should be. The last point here is we need to focus on test score validity, not candidate behavior. We are invalidating your score because we can't trust the score. We don't know exactly what happened. We're not saying you cheated, but the data suggests this score should not stand. Let's go forward, please. So we talked about stakeholders, and I think this is one of the, as far as I'm concerned, one of the key takeaways. You have to get the team unified. You have to decide, and to do that, you need to set appropriate expectations, what you can do with doing data analysis and statistics and what you cannot do. You know, often you hear things like zero tolerance. We have zero tolerance to cheating. Well, that's probably not a reasonable policy. Zero tolerance for cheating means we want no type 2 errors, which means we have to lower those thresholds down, and we're going to invalidate a lot of scores we shouldn't invalidate. On the other hand, the see no evil approach is, well, there's nothing wrong with our program. We do not need to measure. We do not need to manage because no one cheats. That is also not reasonable. There will be people who will strive to gain an advantage. And it's really important as you communicate and set these expectations with the stakeholders that you develop and report key metrics. how many tests are invalidating, how many tests are being detected that we're invalidating, how many test sites do we have issues with, when and how often do we have to replace the test questions, how often, what's the impact? Those are the questions the stakeholders need to have answers for. Let's go forward, please. And I think we're finished with this part of the presentations. We'll turn the time over to Skylar. Questions, please let us know.
Thanks, Dennis. I did get a question after we talked a little bit about EVT items in the question. Please lay out for our attendees, Dennis, again, what exactly is an EVT or embedded verification item?
Okay, so I like to think of these as new questions, old questions. You want to use, so these are questions that have never been out there. You need to use really good quality control to develop these questions, or test them out in a very controlled circumstance where you know they're not being exposed and compromised. Now you put these questions on the exam, you compare performance for these new questions with the old questions that are already out on the exam, and then by comparing performance you can decide whether or not we have an inconsistency. They can be scored or not scored depending on your policy.
Thanks, Dennis. I got another question here. Could you please give an example of the type of test that you've seen that is taken by a proxy test taker? The type of test.
Well, we've seen proxy test takers take tests for college exams. Just like that website said, you tell us the exam and we'll find the expert for you. We see people that offer those. We definitely see proxy test taking as a very large problem with IT programs. I remember at ATP that GMAT was showing some slides talking about proxy test takers. So we know that when there's a buck to be made, and if people are really proficient, and someone else, if there's a market, supply and demand, there will be a market there. You will be able to find someone.
Thank you, Dennis. I had another question here. Will a copy of this presentation be available? The answer is yes, of course. We will provide you with slides and hopefully a video recording of this session if you'd like to review it. And I have another question here for you, Dennis. The question is, have Trojan horses ever been used, and how successful is that kind of strategy? Maybe Trojan items is what they're talking about.
So Trojan horse item is an item. Yes, they have been used. Was an idea that was first proposed by Gene Radford of EMC. Trojan horse item is an item that is intentionally miskeyed and placed on the exam. It's not scored. It's supposed to be a very easy item that has the wrong key. The intent of the item, and usually you have a bank of these 5 or 6 on the exam. A person who gets a score of 6 on the Trojan horse questions with the wrong answer key, you have a fairly good idea they really do not know what they're doing, and they have just kind of gone through by rote and memorized things. The intent of the questions is to detect people who are using stolen answer keys.
Thank you, Dennis.
And yes, they have been used, especially in IT organizations, where answer key theft has been a problem.
Thank you, Dennis. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Steve, would that be all right?
Yeah, I want to give Skylar a plug here. One of the questions is, where do you start to look for your test items online? And Skylar has undertaken the Caveon Security Minute, which provides quick 1.5 minute videos to help you do just that. How do I start to look online for my IP? And so I invite you to, when we send out our follow-up materials, we'll make sure there are links for the Caveon Security Minute, and you can see Skylar's take in answering that question. And then, do you want to pose the last one, Skylar, for Dennis?
Yeah, I think the last one's appropriate, and I think it's right up Dennis's alley. So I'll read it to you, Dennis, and this is probably geared more towards you based on your experience and level of work with K12. It says, how vigilant do you believe various states are considering all of this in their public school, state-mandated exams, particularly the most high stakes, such as the need for graduation?
Oh, that's how vigilant are they? You know, I would like to say there's a number 25 or 30, but there's not. It varies a lot by the states and a lot by what they're doing. The very first rule is if you don't measure, you can't manage. So if a state is not really looking at the data and doing something, they're not going to be able to see it. I wish I had time to tell you a story, but we know what happens is that a lot of things happen in schools, and not everyone is always attentive the way they should be. There are proctoring lapses, and we know that sometimes educators engage in misconduct also. We've seen that, and the only way to be sure that in state educations the tests are being delivered properly and that scores really mean what they're supposed to mean is to do some monitoring and some follow-up and to some verification. Trust but verify.
Well, and Dennis, just to pile on, we do know, because we work with several states that have extensive data forensics programs in place to illuminate and detect just these kinds of situations. So we're bumping up on the hour. We always strive to keep these sessions an hour or less. If there are no more questions, I think we can declare victory, and we hope this has been useful, helpful information. Slides will be available. A recording of the presentation will be available, and hopefully we'll see you next month when we take a look at protecting your IP in other ways. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great day.